Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am hoping to tell you a little bit today about all those people who drive you crazy. So if you've got some of those, listen up. That's what we're going to talk about. More seriously, I teach a program called Leading Business into the Future, where one of the major premises is that we need to be more accepting of diverse points of view. And I use what I'm going to do next as one way to help us think about some of those diverse points of view and hopefully come to the conclusion that it's okay if people think differently. It's normal. So I'm going to talk about the generations, but as you listen, I hope you'll think also about any kind of diversity, any way that you're different, anybody who's driving you crazy from any other perspective. Now, here's the interesting thing. It turns out that all of us walk around every day with a lens in our pocket. And when something happens to you, a new event, you pull your lens out and you look at it through that lens. And I do the same thing. I look at it through my lens. And through my lens, it may look like a fantastic development. So I say, great, I love it, I'll do it. And you're going, wait a minute, this doesn't look good through my lens. This looks scary, looks threatening. I don't want to do it. And of course, we then instantly look at each other and think, where are you coming from? You have such a different perspective than I do. And these lenses are a very normal thing to have. The idea behind them actually comes out of developmental psychology. This chipper young man shown up here is Dr. Jean Piaget. Piaget and his colleagues found out that kids learn different things at different times. So do any of you have little kids at home, like 2, 3, 4? Okay. Do you ever feel like they're not listening to you? Once in a while? All right. Well, Piaget would say little kids are not listening to you. Little kids are figuring out the concrete world. So they're very focused on tangible physical objects. They're trying to figure out if they turn a crank, a clown pops out of a box, they push a button, a sound occurs. So they're thinking about physical relationships of tangible, concrete things. But do any of you have kids at home between the ages of 11 and 15? Okay, you be very careful. Because they are listening to every word you say. They're hanging on every single word. And this is the time, Piaget tells us, when they're trying to figure out, what kind of a world is this that I live in? What's this place all about? And one of the things they're thinking about is, what's Dad worried about? How did Mom react to this event that just happened in the news? How are my teachers thinking about it? And so the kinds of reactions that you have to the events around you in the world are huge during this age. I would say to you, if you are a parent or plan to be a parent in the future, when your kids are between 11 and 15, you must take time to talk with them. So if something happens, the stock market crashes, Trump is elected president, something. You need to talk with your children about, what does this mean for us, for you? How do you think about it? What does it mean for the world? Because this is when you're forming your mental map. And I would pretty much guarantee you that whatever was happening to you when you were 11 to 15 still influences you today. Still today, when an unexpected event occurs, you look at it through your 11 to 15-year-old lens. Now, sure, you get older, you get more rational, maybe you move through that phase more quickly, but it's still colored, and that knee-jerk reaction can be part of it. The other thing to keep in mind, of course, is that a lot of stuff happened to you when you were 11 to 15, most of which I know absolutely nothing about. So, for example, your parents' political views, your religious education, your ethnicity, your cultural heritage, your socioeconomic background, all of that was really important in making you an individual. So on one hand, whenever you hear somebody talking about the generations, take it with some grain of salt, because obviously you're an individual. Whatever happened and shaped your lens was very personal to you. But because the people who were 11 to 15 at the same time you were, particularly in the same place you were, would have seen some of the same things, there's going to be a little thread of commonality, something you share. Not everything, but something. So first of all, talking about the generations is an exercise in kind of balancing two paradoxical ideas. One is we're all individuals, and two is you probably have something in common with people the same age as you. So don't get too far on either end of the spectrum. Both are true. I'm not trying to label everyone one way or another. But you do find these common events. The other thing I want to say in terms of context about the generations is that there's no crisp definition. So I don't want anybody to get totally excited about any date. I can positively guarantee you that there is no one I've found yet in about 20 years of working on this subject who woke up on January 1st of a year and said, I'm a new generation. So there's no sharp cutoff between December 31st and January 1st. Obviously, it's a spectrum. So we have ideas that are shaped along a spectrum. Wherever you are on that spectrum, you're going to have a little of this and a little of that. It really relates to when you were 11 to 15. But what's most important is what was happening in the adult world. And I want to emphasize that. It's basically what were adults talking about that has a huge impact on what shaped kids. And I'm going to go very quickly through the three older generations, which probably represent most of us here today. So I'm sorry we don't have time to talk about them in great detail. But I want to tell you just a little about it so we have some contrast to the generations we are going to talk about in more detail. So people who are in their 70s and 80s today, I call traditionalists. They tend to be quite different around the world. If you imagine people that age growing up in China or India or the United States or Brazil, etc., they obviously had very different experiences. However, I find there is a sense of collectivity. In other words, wanting to be part of the whole. These are people who tend, in most parts of the world, to value conforming, joining, being part of the existing society, etc. They also tend to be fairly loyal to that and to fall in line with it. It's important to think about them because I would argue they shaped many of the organizations that most of us work in today. So these kind of values around loyalty and hierarchy are ones that are very common. People who are in their 60s and maybe late 50s today, in many parts of the world, not all, grew up in what we call a baby boom. So they grew up at a time when basically people were having more kids every year. And that in itself is a very interesting phenomenon. I want you to imagine, since many of you look like you're not baby boomers, what it would be like to grow up in a world where, there might be 20 kids in the class ahead of you in school, 24 in your class, 28 in the next class, 32 in the next class. And pretty soon the principal says, we don't have enough chairs. Pretty literally, we don't have enough seats in this building for all these kids that are pouring in so quickly. And so many boomers in many parts of the world had the experience, literally, of going to school in a temporary building out behind the main building because there weren't enough chairs. There weren't enough seats. Now just think about how that shapes your brain cells as a kid. There are not enough chairs for you in the building. What does that tell you about your life? How are you going to have to live it? What's it tell you about how things are going to be? What? Hard. Yeah, hard. What else? Huh?
Survival of the fittest.
Survival of the fittest. Yes, I think that's exactly right. It says, boy, I better be the fittest, right? Because there aren't going to be enough chairs in college, there aren't going to be enough chairs at work, and so I better be the fittest one out there. And so being good, being competitive, ends up being a characteristic we often see in this generation. They can be a little nutty sometimes, work endless hours. And then you get to what we call Generation X, people in their 40s and 50s today, late 30s. these people grew up at a time where in many parts of the world, we were beginning to change the social contract between individuals and organizations. So this is a time where companies began to lay people off. Did you know that in the United States, the US government did not collect statistics on layoffs until 1981? Think about that. And the reason is layoffs were a very unusual phenomenon prior to the 1980s. So it's been pretty recently that companies started to say, hey, you're laid off, goodbye. Before that, people had a reasonable expectation that they would work their entire career with that company. So these guys were little kids and saw dad laid off from the job he had planned to spend his life with. Divorce rates skyrocketed in many parts of the world. Many of these guys were latchkey kids. They took care of themselves. They were home alone. Two-parent families, both working. I remember interviewing one Xer who said to me, you know, now that you mention it, I don't know where my parents were when I was a teenager. I don't remember ever seeing them. Now, almost unbelievable in today's world. But that sense of taking care of yourself, being independent, etc., being self-reliant is very much a characteristic of this generation. So many in this generation say to themselves, I need to be able to take care of myself. That's the driving lesson I pulled away from being 11 to 15. Take care of yourself. Have options. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Make sure you could have a plan B if plan A doesn't go well. So are they disloyal? Not really. I wouldn't use that word. What I would say is they're never going to put all their trust in any institution. They're always going to have a backup plan. Most Xers tell me they're doing this today, but they got this going on the side, and they're working on this just in case. So that sense of backup plans is very big. So those are the three generations that precede. And as you can see, very different ways of looking at things. Let me give you one example of how an event in the workplace can look different between a boomer and an Xer, just to put it in perspective. I'd like you all for a moment to imagine you're boomers, okay? So there weren't enough chairs when you went to school, and you've been working like a dog to make sure you stayed ahead of the pack, survival of the fittest ever since then, okay? And I'm your boss. And I walk in one day and I say, we'd like you to relocate to corporate headquarters. Now, how does that sound, boomers? How does it sound to a boomer? We'd like you to relocate to corporate headquarters. What's that say? You're nodding yes. It sounds like you've made it. It sounds like you've won. Could you say? You've been chosen. I've selected you out of all of these riffraff. I chose you to go to corporate headquarters. You're the survivor. Da, da, da. So in fact, it would be good news to most boomers, right? Now, imagine you're all Xers. You like options. You don't put too much faith in an institution. And I'm your boomer boss. So I'm going to walk in there. I'm going to walk into your office, and I'm going to deliver some news. And first, I want you to know, before I do it, I'm going to spend a minute in the hallway savoring the thought of that hug you're going to give me. Because I know in a second I am coming in with news that is so good, you're going to be out of your chair and in my arms, right? I'm ready. So I walk in and I say, hey, we'd like you to relocate to corporate headquarters.
I have to pay for relocation.
Do I have to pay for my own relocation? I've never heard that one. That's good. But you get a different reaction, right? At a minimum, you get people who say, can I think about it? I've got to talk it over. They may say why. I've had people say, what did I do wrong? Is there a problem? It's a very different reaction. And the point I'd like you to take away is that both reactions, in my view, are totally logical, totally fine, totally normal, totally consistent with the lens that each person carries around. There's nothing wrong with it. So if you're a boomer and you've had that reaction from Xers, don't get upset. That's a normal Xer reaction. If you're an Xer and you wonder why those boomers are so insanely enthusiastic about accepting everything that comes along, that's just the way they are. Not much you can do about it. Normal, logical, totally fine. Okay, with that, let's talk about the young kids. So here's some of the stuff that I would say influenced the development of what we often call millennials, or sometimes we call Gen Ys. I would say roughly we're talking about people born between about 1980 and 1995. And they had some certain characteristics. I personally think the major characteristic in many parts of the world is that they saw events that were unexpected. They grew up with terrorism and school violence being very much the topic of adult conversations in many parts of the world. And what's interesting about these phenomena is, unlike going off to war, where a reasonable person would have a reasonable expectation that they may have put themselves in harm's way, nobody thinks they put themselves in harm's way when they went to school. The fact that something bad happened was random, inexplicable. The fact that something bad happened in the subway was random, inexplicable. On the train in France, random. In 9/11, random. That's the primary idea that exists within the minds of this generation. Random stuff happens. Now, if that were your mental model, random stuff happens, how would you choose to live your life? Live for today. Thank you. Yes, I think exactly. And I think that would be a brilliant and logical conclusion to come to. And I think it's exactly the conclusion most millennials have come to. I'm going to wring every ounce out of today because I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So stop telling me about what's going to happen to me in 2 years if I do this boring, grubby job. I want to know about today. I want to make sure what I'm doing right now today is meaningful and challenging and interesting and fun if it possibly can be. I'm going to wring the best out of today. They also had digital technology, and they grew up with parents who absolutely loved them. So there really is a fascinating body of data about how our parenting attitudes changed between the people who parented Xers, who, as I just told the story, many of whom didn't spend that much time with their kids. They were off doing other things and managing their lives. And the people who parented millennials, who hovered over them, who did things with them, who enjoyed every moment of this parenting experience. So, living in a world in which inexplicable things happen has caused them to have that reaction. Let me say a little bit about the technology. Explain that just a bit more. Because what I think is interesting, now this is the first generation that I would call unconsciously competent. And by that I mean, most of us in this room are probably really good at using computers and digital technology, mobile phones, we're all good at it. But most of us learned it as adults. A few of you may be young enough you don't remember learning it. Then you're an unconscious user. So if you learn something before you actually can think about the process of learning it, what you tend to do is use it to do something new. Whereas people like me, who learn it consciously, use it to do things we may already have known to do. Okay? So here's an example about technology. Now, I'm pretty old, so I want you to imagine one of those ladies is me. Okay? And I'd like to go out to lunch with my friend. Tell me how I would do it. How do I go about the process of going out to lunch with a friend? What would I do? What would I do first? What do you think? What?
Maybe you call.
Maybe I'd call, right. I might use one of those things called phones. Yeah, I'd call. When would I do this? When do you think I'd do this? A few weeks? Oh, well, maybe. Months, maybe. quite a bit in advance, right? I would do it a long time in advance. We'd all agree to that. Okay, now here's the important part. What would happen during the course of this phone call? What would my friend and I get to eventually? We'd arrange a time, a place, a date, a type of food we wanted to eat. We'd figure out who was going to drive and what we were going to wear, right? We would make a plan. Plan, yes. And the point is, I would make a plan whether I used smoke signals or WhatsApp. The technology doesn't matter because the process would be the same. Even if I wanted to use a digital technology, I would do it weeks in advance and I would create a plan. I could use smoke signals and do the same thing because it's not about the technology, it's about the process. Now, let's think about a young person today. Let's just say that this young lady would like to go out to lunch with her friends. How is she going to go about it? What's she going to do? Post it on Facebook, okay? She might post it on Facebook. She might use some other form of social media. When would she do this? Okay, we got an hour before. Anybody want to go in closer? I'm going to suggest to you actually that it will be when she feels hunger pains, okay? Do you guys remember hearing about that scientist Pavlov? He did research on what dogs do when they're hungry. He found out when dogs feel hunger pains, they drool. Well, my research would say when millennials feel hunger pains, they text. So she feels hungry. She gets some form of digital technology going. Now, here's the really important part. What's in her communication? What does she say to the other person?
One emoji.
Emoji, okay. She puts an emoji. What else? What does she put in there? Is it a plan? Do you want to have lunch? Okay, that's one idea. What else do you think?
Or maybe an opening statement about if she's hungry.
I'm
I'm hungry.
hungry, okay. A declarative, I'm hungry, yeah, could be. What else?
Maybe just putting a proposal if you have time, otherwise I'm going.
Okay, maybe just saying, here's where I'm going, right?
What type?
Okay, all right, all right. I'll tell you what I have found is the most common, and you're all really very close to it, is that it would be something location related. So she might, if she's sending out a message, say, basically, where are you? Where are you? And she would then kind of ascertain that person's location. Or she might take a selfie of herself in front of the restaurant, right? And say, I'm here. So she'd send her location. Or she might look at the dots on the screen and see that Johnny's right around the corner, so she could get in touch with him quickly. But one way or another, the primary thing they would communicate would be location. They would then begin a process, kind of like ships using radar, and they would home in on each other until they ended up at the same place, but they would never have planned in quite the same way that I would have. It would have been, I'm here, okay, I'm headed there, okay, I'm headed here. I don't know if any of you here are old enough to have had kids at this age, but I can remember driving mine, I thought, to one friend's house. So I think I'm driving to, Joe's house. My son is in the seat next to me, busily texting away. And he goes, Mom, they've all moved over to Harry's. And I'm wheeling around town, like a nut, trying to catch up with this roving band of children. Because there's no plan, there's just coordination. So that's a very key aspect of who these guys are. They coordinate, they don't plan. And how about this? Has anybody ever seen these? I have to confess, we have a couple of them in our cupboard at home. These are the plates we fed these children off of. We had posters in their schools that said these things. But we fed them continually the message that they were very special. You are so special today. We've told them that from the beginning. They were constantly reminded. I had one human resource person say to me, I spend hours writing job descriptions. I list every qualification you must have before you can apply for a job. She said, fully half of the people who apply for my jobs don't have any of the relevant qualifications. Not one. I said, do you have children? She said, oh, yes, I do. I said, have you ever said to your kids, you can do anything you set your mind to? She said, I said that every day. I said, they're here. These kids aren't weird. They're just following what we've told them for 20 years. We've drilled this into their head. So millennials are very immediate. They live life to the fullest each day. And they want work that's meaningful. You cannot tell them that they have to do a boring job for 2 years and expect them to put up with it. That's just not going to fly. I have executives tell me, how can I make them do this? I say, I have not the slightest idea. I have no advice for you. I don't think it's possible. They don't want to do boring work for 2 years. They don't want to hear that they've got to do this and then you'll talk about something interesting. So it's got to have this. If not, they're going to move on. They're going to want more. When I'm not teaching here in London or traveling, I often do research out of my home, which is in the United States. And a couple of summers ago, I had a knock on the door as I was working. I answered the door. There's a very nice young man there, clearly a millennial, clean cut, wholesome, looked very normal kind of guy. He said to me, I'd like to work here. I said, well, this is a home. He said, well, yeah, I know, but I was driving by just now and I saw it and it looked interesting and I'd like to work here. Now, I will tell you, honestly, we live on a little farm. So he saw animals and farm, and that apparently caught his attention. So I talked to him, and he told me he'd gone to college, but really hadn't found it challenging. So he left. Then he got a job. Really didn't find it meaningful, so he left. But he was driving by, and at that moment, he saw our place, and he thought that looked perhaps challenging and meaningful. So he pulled in. That night, I tell a story to my husband. He says, that guy sounds like a pervert. I hope you got rid of him. I said, well, honestly, he sounds like a millennial. I hired him. And so this young man worked with us for a couple of months till he found, I guess, that farming wasn't quite as challenging and meaningful as he perhaps had hoped. And he moved on to other things. But this sense of you've got to challenge me and make it meaningful every moment is just who they are. It's something that companies must respond to. They're confident and they feel able to figure things out. Their parents have told them this for 20 years. You can figure it out. So they seek challenge through responsibility. It's important that companies give them responsibility. I always recommend, even if it's a fairly straightforward job that needs to get done, ask them to help you think about how they could redesign it as they're doing it. Add that challenge onto it. Add that creativity into it so that they have an extra opportunity. And they're certainly not deterred by what you or I might perceive as a lack of experience. After all, Mom said they can do anything. They're coordinators. That's the technology. So they're accustomed to doing things anytime, anywhere, asynchronously. They don't feel they have to all be together necessarily, although they like to get together once in a while. But this sense of why do we all have to be in the office from 8:30 to 5? I mean, they can't believe it. What kind of a ridiculous rule is that? Let's just get together when we need to. Let's coordinate. They're focused on what I would call task, not time. They want to do the task. They'll work hard, but they'll work as much or as little as is necessary to get the job done. They're comfortable with adults. They're used to hanging out with their parents and their parents' friends. So yes, they would walk up to a senior executive and say, here's my point of view on something. They're not necessarily shy about doing that. They're used to being with adults who would talk with them about controversial topics. They know how to self-advocate. That's something we told them to be sure to do. They're used to choosing among options and being given choices. All of these things, trust, is something that they grew up with as children and they expect to find when they come into the workplace. And how about this one? We've all read these terrible books, and I do have to tell you, I hate them. I hate it when I see these guys labeled as trophy kids. I think this is really one of the sloppiest pieces of thinking around, because really, who were these trophies for? Let's be real. Parents, exactly. I don't know any boomer parent who wants to go to a child's soccer game on Saturday morning, stand there in the rain, and not come home with a trophy. Boomers love trophies. So boomers bought some trophies. They gave them to these little children who faithfully transferred them into the hands of other boomer parents. These children are nothing more than trophy transport systems. That's their role in the process. Today, those trophies are where? They're at mom's house. If the child ever wanted to take them, and personally I've never met a single millennial who wanted to take those trophies to their new home, they would probably have to pry them out of mom's cold, dead fingers in order to get their hands on them. These are the parents' trophies. Doesn't have anything to do with the kids. So don't get hung up on that. They are collaborative. They learn through personal instruction. They don't expect to be told, here's a manual to read. They want to talk to you about it. And feedback has a very different meaning for them. Think about, again, like boomers. You're a boomer. I'd like to give you some feedback. How's that sound to boomers? Criticism, exactly. The word feedback to a boomer means I want to assess you, judge you, probably criticize you. That's what we think of as feedback. But to these guys, it doesn't mean that. So we have them in the workplace, and they're saying 10 times a day, give me some feedback, give me some feedback, give me some feedback, right? And a boomer, a sensible boomer, would say, look, I told you last week you're doing fine. If you're ever not doing fine, I'll mention it. But until then, your performance review is in 11 and a half months. Please leave, right? And they're not happy. Because what does the word feedback mean to a millennial? What?
Praise.
Nope, not going to accept that. It's not praise. What does it mean?
Growth.
What?
Growth. Growth.
Growth. Okay, I like that. That's good. Sort of validation. Validation alone is not enough. What else? Okay, I like that, but not quite enough. Development. Okay, I'm going to use the word teaching. The word feedback to a millennial means teach me. When they say give me some feedback, they're saying stop what you're doing, take some time, and teach me. Teach me how I could do it better. Teach me what you know about it, etc. So yes, they say give me feedback all the time, but what they're saying is not judge me. Nobody in their right mind wants to be judged 10 times a day, and they're certainly in their right minds. They want to be taught. They want to learn. They want to be coached. They want to be mentored. So it has a very different connotation. There's the millennials. They're immediate, they're confident, they're digital natives, they like adults, and they're very collaborative. It's a great generation, and one that we need to, I think, revamp our organizations to make sure we're making them feel welcome. Now let me say just a little bit. Oh, forgot I put these slides in here. Ooh, yeah. You've probably seen these, but I just would remind us, they also vote differently than old people. So here's how they voted on Brexit. You can see in this particular case, blue is stay, and you can see much higher for the youngers than for the olders. And here's the map which says what would have happened to the Electoral College if only the millennials had been allowed to vote for Mrs. Clinton or Donald Trump. So we would have had an almost all blue map if that had been true.
Just a question, yeah, or an observation. But they just didn't turn out in numbers, though.
No, they didn't. They didn't. The young people didn't turn out in the same numbers that they did for Obama, and the blacks didn't turn out in the same number as they did for Obama. So
Even in Brexit.
or even in Brexit, yeah. Yeah, so we didn't have the turnout. If we had just taken the opinions of the ones that did turn out, though, we'd have a map like this. But you're right, turnout was an issue, no doubt about it.
That's a key point. I think the newspaper was just reiterating the millennials' view. They were just reiterating the view of the millennials. That was basically what the newspaper was saying was going to happen. That's why we thought that was what was going to happen. But they were just ignoring the rest.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I don't disagree with it. I'm not sure that's the cause and effect. In other words, I don't know that the newspapers only spoke to millennials. I don't know. I mean, the mystery of how the newspapers got it so wrong is what I'm sure we'll hear many people comment about. All right, I don't have too much time, but I do want to tell you about kids, because I'm thinking many of you may have people who are not millennials living in your home. And the people who are not millennials, I call the regeneration, because I think this is going to be a generation that's going to be about renewal, about conservation, about taking care of our resources, about making the most of what we have. And this is a generation, again, born roughly 96 onward. Again, don't get too hung up. So kind of 20-ish and under today. That was very heavily influenced by the global financial recession. That's a lot of what they've heard about: economic trauma, economic difficulties, etc. They also know a lot about resource shortages, water, energy. They, of course, grew up not just with digital technology, but mobile, right here in their pocket. They've been reared not by boomers, competitive boomers, but by self-reliant Xers, who I'm sure have passed along the message of learn how to take care of yourself. And they've grown up with reality TV. So not some fairy tale, but let's all jump in a pit of glue and waller around and see if we can win some money. So that's what their life is like. The sharpest change they've seen was in the economy. Big change, big shock to adults. Adults talked about it. I would say if you have kids and did not talk to them about the economic changes that we've gone through, do not kid yourself that they're unaware of it. I have a lot of business executives say, well, my kids didn't know anything about that because I kept my job and we had no changes. You are just crazy, because your kids do know about it. They may be worrying about it even more. They may be thinking, what is Dad not telling me? How come he hasn't mentioned this? So this is a big issue for young people. They probably know more about environmental issues than most of us here in the room. They study it in their geography classes, so they know about world water shortages, energy, carbon emissions, ozone layers. They know all that stuff, and they worry about it at a level that's more visceral than many of other older individuals. And they have mobile technologies. In the US, I know most 11-year-olds, about half, little over half of all 11-year-olds have their own personal mobile phone. Almost all the rest of them soon thereafter. So basically, this generation has their own phones. They're already communicating. I would say one of the interesting things is that when we talked about millennials being immediate, I would say I see a much greater sense of patience with this generation. And I pick that out of the fact that many of them in the surveys that I've done, and again, I've only been able to survey them while they're young, so there may be some changes, but I find 13, 14, and 15-year-olds who are saving. Now that's not a trait we saw among millennials. This generation saves money. So if they want a bicycle, they save money to get it. So they are saving their money for future purchases. In fact, they tell me very emphatically they never want to incur debt. Most of them tell me they never plan to have a credit card. Now, will this change? It might. I mean, again, they'll get older, it might change. But their current thinking is no debt. They want to do everything on a cash basis. So they defer gratification and have this incredible reluctance to incur debt. They also have a remarkably utilitarian point of view toward objects. In fact, they tell me they don't particularly care to own much of anything. They don't think houses confer social status, so they don't necessarily want to own a house. They're happy to rent. They don't think cars confer social status. So they don't need to own a fancy car, just something utilitarian is fine, or even Uber. They rent, they borrow, they trade, they improvise. I think they're going to be renters, many of them for life. Many of them tell me they never want to have a mortgage. Now again, do I think some of them will have mortgages? Yes, I do. But I think they will enter into that commitment with a very different feeling in their gut than I had when I entered into my first. When my husband and I bought our first house, it was a celebration. It was a joyous occasion. For these guys, buying their first house, if they do it, will be very worrisome. It will be something they enter into with great seriousness and a sense of trepidation. They already rent a lot of stuff. They rent bikes, they rent prom dresses, they of course rent cars. This is what they want to do. There's a product out there that's growing in popularity in many markets. I know we have it here in London and many other cities I've been in, where you can buy just enough raw food to cook one dinner. So you get kind of a prepackaged amount of raw food, like one chicken breast and one tiny little package of paprika, right? And the whole thing on a per item basis costs like 100 times more than if you went to Costco and bought a giant jar of paprika, right? You're paying a huge premium for this little packet. So I think it's a stupid idea. I think it's one of the dumbest product ideas ever. I never would have invented it. Wouldn't have occurred to me. Don't get it. But when I talk to regens, they love them. And when I asked one regen why, she of course looked at me like I was pretty darn stupid. And she said, well, because I don't have to own a bottle of paprika, duh. Now, I would just like to pause on this for a minute, because I think this is an analogy you should hold in your mind as you think about this generation. This is a generation of people for whom ownership of a bottle of paprika feels onerous, because she would have to store it, she would have to move it if she were to change rentals, she would have to check the expiration date, and she doesn't want any of that. She doesn't want that responsibility of owning paprika. So having just a little packet, just when she needs it, is far more preferable, even if the per unit price is much higher. You will be serving, those of you who are in marketing, you are going to be marketing to a group of people who don't want to own paprika. If you're selling them anything bigger than that, you better start thinking fast, because you're going to have to come up with different ownership models. They don't want to own stuff. And particularly, they don't want to own stuff that they're going to use infrequently. So if I were thinking about business opportunities, I would start to go through the list of things you use only once a week. And I will guarantee you, they will find a way to rent those. So if you think, for example, about, let's say they do get a house and need a lawnmower, well, you only use a lawnmower for an hour a week, right? They would find it insane to own a lawnmower. Why would anybody own an object you're only going to use an hour a week? So they will instead find a way to rent it. If you're looking for business opportunities, that's what you want to look for. Okay, I want to be respectful of our next speaker and make sure that I stop on time, so I'll just see if there's any others I want to mention. They have a very sense of finite, so they tend to be viscerally concerned about conservation. I have lots of stories from parents who tell me that kids this age actually cry if they find their family wasting water or energy or something of that sort. I mean, a very strong passion for saving. They care very deeply about the environment. And I find that they make compromises, not just collaborate, but compromise. I hear even the youngest children saying, we'll do this for her and that for him. So making that sense of parsing things out is important. And because they've had the mobile technology, they're like this little chap. I don't know if any of you ever saw the commercial, but this was a commercial in the US where this kid traded stocks out of his baby crib. And of course, the point was he had as much access to information as his dad did, because he's got mobile technology, dad has mobile technology, so why not? He might as well trade too. So that's very much how they tend to view about the life. This is a group that I think is going to be very focused on what's real, what's finite. They're going to be empowered because they've got this ubiquitous information. They're going to conserve and renew, and they're going to insist that we do it too. If you've got a company that's not into that, get into it because they're going to really insist you do. They're frugal. They're pragmatic. They make trade-offs. They compromise, and they're very committed to make a difference. Those of you who are their parents, congratulations. I think you're raising a really cool generation. And those of you who are getting ready to employ them, I think you're going to like them a lot. But I think they're going to put some tough demands on us to build companies that will be responsive to the things they care about. Significant global differences. Oh, okay, I got to show you this now that I clicked on a slide. This is just to say that some organizations use this idea of what generations care about to shape their marketing. And the very best example that I found is the US Army. So excuse me for using a US Army example, but it's so good, I couldn't resist. This is the ad they used when they wanted to attract that generation that I said liked to join and liked authority. Brilliant, isn't it? You've got an authority figure telling you to join. This is the ad they used for the idealistic boomers. Very soft and beautiful, be all you can be, right? Then they wanted to attract the self-reliant Xers, and they came up with this. I don't even know what this means. But apparently it said something to Xers. Then they wanted to get to those millennials who just love their parents and whose parents just love them, and they came up with an ad directed at the parents. They said, if you made them strong, we'll make the Army strong. Send your kids to the Army. So they marketed to the parents. And here's what they're saying today to these wonderful regens. They're basically talking about changing the world. So the message today is the Army's going to give you the strength to do good today, and you're going to defend tomorrow if you enlist today. This is an organization that understands generational insights and knows how to speak to the heart of each generation. I hope this has given you some insights as well. Thanks very much.